He had been loyal for nearly 2 decades. But when George Pierce, a mild-mannered, elderly security expert, is fired without cause by his ruthless manager, Catherine Turner, his life seems shattered. What she doesn't know is that George isn't just any employee, he's a former FBI agent with connections to some of the most dangerous people in the world. And now, he's about to unleash a storm that will tear her empire apart. The question is, will Catherine's arrogance cost her everything before she even realizes who she's really dealing with? The fluorescent lights hummed above George Pierce's desk as Catherine Turner's heels clicked across the marble floor. She stopped 3 feet from him, her shadow falling across his keyboard like a blade. "George, my office." "Now." He didn't look up immediately. His fingers hovered over the quarterly compliance report he'd been reviewing for the past hour. 23 years. 23 years of walking through these doors, and he'd learned to read the temperature of a room by the way people breathed. Catherine wasn't breathing normally. He rose slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, and followed her past the row of junior analysts who suddenly found their screens fascinating. The walk to her corner office took 47 seconds. He'd counted it many times before. She didn't offer him a seat. "I'll make this quick," Catherine said, positioning herself behind her mahogany desk like a general addressing a prisoner of war. Her fingers drummed against a manila folder. "The firm is restructuring. Your position has been eliminated." George blinked. Twice. Eliminated. Cost-cutting measures. She opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper toward him. "Your severance package. 2 weeks. Sign at the bottom." The office seemed to shrink. George stared at the paper, at the typed words that reduced 2 decades of his life to a transaction. His throat tightened, but his face remained still as lake water. "May I ask why?" Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "George, let's be honest. The industry has evolved. Your methods, your thinking, they belong to a different era. We need fresh perspectives. Young blood." She glanced toward the glass wall where Lance Bowman sat in the adjacent conference room, feet propped on the table, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. The same Lance Bowman that George had spent 3 months training. "I've given this firm 23 years, George said quietly. "And we appreciate your service." Catherine's tone suggested she appreciated it about as much as she appreciated the outdated printer in the supply closet. But Harrison and more advisors must look forward, not backward. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You have 30 minutes. The words landed like punches to his gut. George's hands trembled, not from weakness, but from something he hadn't felt in years. Something he'd buried deep beneath layers of patience and professionalism. What would you do if someone erased 23 years of your life in 30 seconds? Would you fight? Would you beg? Or would you wait? Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story." George picked up the pen. His hand steadied. He signed his name in the same precise cursive he'd used on thousands of documents throughout his career: arrest warrants, surveillance authorizations, classified reports that had toppled criminal empires. Catherine didn't know about any of that. She saw a 72-year-old man with gray hair and a stooped posture. She saw someone to be discarded, forgotten, erased from the company directory before lunch. She had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. "Thank you for your years of service," Catherine said, already reaching for her phone, already moving on to the next item on her agenda. George tucked the severance paper into his jacket pocket. He turned toward the door, then paused. "Catherine." She looked up, irritation flickering across her features. "I hope Lance works out for you," George said. His voice carried no malice, no bitterness. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the calm of a man who'd interrogated terrorists and never raised his voice once. He walked out of her office, past the junior analysts who still refused to meet his eyes, past the reception desk where Martha pretended to organize papers, past the elevator bank where 2 security guards waited with a cardboard box. 30 minutes later, George Pierce stood on the sidewalk outside Harrison and Moore Advisors, holding everything that remained of his professional life. A coffee mug, 3 framed photographs, a retirement clock he'd received at his 20th anniversary that had never kept accurate time. The Chicago wind cut through his coat as he stared up at the building's glass facade. 47 floors of ambition, greed, and secrets. And George knew where all the secrets were buried. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. Heard what happened. Coffee tomorrow? Same place as always. George smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who'd just been handed a key to a door his enemies didn't know existed. Catherine Turner had fired him without cause. She had no idea he was about to give her one. The coffee shop on Michigan Avenue hadn't changed in 15 years. Same cracked leather booths. Same water stain on the ceiling shaped like Florida. Same burnt smell from the ancient espresso machine that the owner refused to replace. George slid into the booth facing the door, old habits, and waited. Marcus Webb arrived at exactly 9:47 a.m., 3 minutes early, just like always. His former partner at the bureau had put on weight since retirement, but his eyes still swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent 30 years expecting ambushes. "You look like hell," Marcus said, dropping into the seat across from him. "Good to see you too." Marcus ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. The waitress, a woman in her 60s who'd been serving them for over a decade, didn't bother writing it down. "So," Marcus leaned forward, forearms on the table. Catherine Turner finally pulled the trigger. George's eyebrows rose slightly. "You knew." "I know everything, George. That's why they paid me the mediocre salary." Marcus accepted his coffee with a nod. Word travels. Especially when someone's stupid enough to fire a man who put away 3 senators and a Supreme Court nominee. The coffee in George's cup had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. The bitterness matched his mood. 23 years, George said. "I watched that firm grow from 40 employees to 400. I built their entire security infrastructure. I vetted every hire above level 6. Including Catherine. George set down his cup. "I flagged concerns in her background check. Discrepancies in her financial history. Unexplained gaps in her employment record. The board ignored every single one." Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, and set it face down on the table. "You want to tell me what's really going on at Harrison and Moore?" George was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, he watched a young mother struggle with a stroller on the sidewalk. A businessman nearly knocked her over, phone pressed to his ear, oblivious. 3 months ago, George began, Catherine hired her nephew. Lance Bowman. 26 years old. MBA from a school I'd never heard of. No relevant experience. She put him in charge of client acquisitions. Nepotism isn't exactly breaking news. No. But what Lance did with that position is. George reached into his jacket and withdrew a small USB drive. He placed it on the table between them like a chess piece. "Last month, I noticed irregularities in the firm's transaction logs. Large sums moving through accounts that shouldn't exist. Shell companies registered in the Caymans, Panama, the usual suspects." Marcus didn't touch the drive. "How large?" 47 million over 18 months. That's just what I found before they cut my access." The coffee shop seemed to grow quieter around them. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You're talking about embezzlement." "I'm talking about embezzlement, securities fraud, and something else." George lowered his voice. "The shell companies aren't random. They're connected to a name I haven't heard in 12 years. John Mallory." Marcus's face went pale. "Mallory's supposed to be dead." "Mallory's supposed to be a lot of things. But I traced 3 wire transfers back to an account he controlled in 2013. Either he's risen from the grave, or someone's using his network." John Mallory. Former congressman. Former power broker. Former target of the largest FBI corruption investigation in Illinois history. An investigation that George Pierce had led from the shadows for 4 years before Mallory's supposed heart attack in a Mexican resort. They never found the body. "George." Marcus's voice dropped to barely a whisper. If Mallory's alive, if he's connected to this firm, then Catherine Turner isn't just corrupt. She's dangerous. I know. And you think she fired you because you were getting too close? George picked up the USB drive and slipped it back into his pocket. I think she fired me because Lance told her to. And I think Lance is feeding information to someone outside the firm. Someone who's been planning this for a very long time. Marcus sat back, exhaling slowly. What do you need? X. Old contacts who still owe favors. People who can look where I can't anymore. And then? George stood, leaving a 20 on the table. The amount was too much for 2 cups of coffee, but the waitress had 3 grandchildren and a husband with medical bills. Then I'm going to do what I should have done 12 years ago. He buttoned his coat against the November chill. I'm going to finish what I started. Marcus grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. George, be careful. People like Mallory, like Catherine, they don't just destroy careers. They destroy lives. George looked down at his old friend's hand, then met his eyes with a gaze that carried the weight of 3 decades of bringing monsters to justice. I'm counting on it. He walked out into the cold Chicago morning, leaving Marcus alone with the terrible knowledge of what was coming. 2 blocks away, in a black sedan with tinted windows, someone lifted a camera and snapped 3 photographs of George Pierce walking toward the L station. The sedan's driver made a phone call. He met with Webb. I think we have a problem. The storage unit on the south side of Chicago hadn't been opened in 7 years. George stood before the rusted metal door, key in hand, listening to the distant rumble of the L train and the faint hum of traffic on the expressway. He'd rented this unit the week after his official retirement from the bureau. Insurance, he'd called it then. A place to keep the things that didn't belong in his home, in his new life, in the quiet existence of a man who was supposed to have left the shadows behind. The lock resisted, then gave way with a groan. Inside, dust motes swirled in the pale light from the single overhead bulb. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled with dates and case numbers that would mean nothing to anyone but him. In the corner sat an old filing cabinet, gray and unremarkable, the kind you'd find in any government office. George pulled open the top drawer. Files. Hundreds of them. Organized by year, by subject, by the names of men and women who had thought themselves untouchable. His fingers found the tab marked Mallory, June 2011 to 2014. The folder was thick. George carried it to an overturned crate and sat down, the cold concrete seeping through his pants as he opened the first page. A photograph stared back at him. John Mallory at 53, silver hair swept back, politician smile, eyes that revealed nothing. Beside it, a surveillance shot taken outside a restaurant in Oak Park, Mallory shaking hands with a man whose face had been circled in red ink. George remembered that night. 12 degrees below zero. He'd sat in an unmarked van for 6 hours, watching, documenting, building a case that would eventually implicate 14 public officials and send 9 of them to federal prison. But not Mallory. Never Mallory. The congressman had been too careful, too connected, too willing to sacrifice others to save himself. When the investigation closed in, he'd vanished, supposedly to Mexico for health reasons. 3 weeks later, his family announced his death from cardiac arrest. No funeral. No body returned to American soil. Just a memorial service attended by the same politicians who'd taken his bribes. George had never believed it. He flipped through the file, past wiretap transcripts and financial records, until he found what he was looking for, a list of shell companies linked to Mallory's operation. 16 names, each one a thread in a web of corruption that had stretched from Chicago to Washington. 3 of those names matched the accounts he'd found in Harrison and Moore's transaction logs. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Stop looking. Final warning. George stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he screenshot the message, forwarded it to a secure email address he'd set up years ago, and went back to reading. The warning told him everything he needed to know. Someone was watching. Someone was scared. He spent the next 4 hours in that storage unit, cross-referencing old intelligence with new suspicions. By the time he emerged, the The sun had set and his back ached from hunching over files on a concrete floor. But he had something now. A pattern. A connection between Mallory's old network and the money flowing through Catherine Turner's firm. And at the center of it all, Lance Bowman. The young man Catherine had forced George to train. The nephew she'd promoted beyond his competence. The reckless fool who thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. Lance wasn't just incompetent. He was a plant. George drove home through empty streets, his mind racing through possibilities. If Lance was connected to Mallory's network, then his hiring wasn't nepotism, it was infiltration. Catherine hadn't promoted her nephew, she'd installed an asset. Which meant Catherine was either a knowing participant or a useful idiot. George suspected the former. He pulled into his driveway at 9:47 p.m., muscle memory guiding him through the familiar motions of parking and killing the engine. The house was dark except for the porch light he always left on. But something was wrong. The front door stood open by 2 inches. George sat motionless in the car, eyes scanning the windows, the bushes, the shadows between houses. His hand moved to the glove compartment where he kept a .38 revolver, another relic of his former life that his wife had begged him to get rid of. He'd never listened. Moving quietly, he approached the house from the side, weapon drawn, breathing controlled. The back door was locked. The windows were intact. Whoever had entered had used the front, which meant they wanted him to know. A message. He pushed the door open with his foot and swept the interior with practiced efficiency. Living room, clear. Kitchen, clear. Bedroom, clear. But his office, the small room at the back of the house where he'd set up his personal computer, had been ransacked. Drawers pulled open. Papers scattered across the floor. His laptop, which he'd left on the desk, was gone. On the wall, written in what looked like red marker, were 3 words. Stop or else. George lowered his weapon and stood in the center of the destruction, surveying the damage with the detached calm of a man who had seen far worse in his career. They'd taken his laptop. They'd searched his files. They thought they'd scared him. They had no idea. He pulled out his phone and dialed Marcus. I need that access we talked about. Tonight. What happened? George looked at the warning on his wall, at the chaos they'd created trying to silence him. They just told me I'm on the right track. Lance Bowman sat in the conference room on the 32nd floor, feet propped on the mahogany table, watching the city lights flicker through floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone displayed a stock ticker that had been climbing all day. A company he'd quietly invested in 3 weeks ago based on information he absolutely should not have possessed. Life was good. The door opened and Catherine swept in, her face tight with something Lance had rarely seen on his aunt. Concern. Put your feet down. We need to talk. Lance swung his legs off the table with exaggerated slowness. What's wrong? Did the board reject my expansion proposal again? Forget the proposal. Catherine closed the door and checked the hallway through the glass before pulling the blinds. George Pierce. The name landed in the room like a grenade. Lance's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. The old man? You fired him 2 weeks ago. What about him? He's investigating us. He met with Marcus Webb yesterday, former FBI, same unit George worked in for 30 years. And last night, someone broke into his house. So, maybe he has bad locks. Catherine grabbed a chair and sat directly across from her nephew, close enough that he could smell her perfume and see the vein pulsing in her temple. Listen to me carefully, because I will not repeat myself. George Pierce is not some confused retiree waiting to collect Social Security. Before he came to this firm, he spent 3 decades dismantling criminal organizations that thought they were untouchable. He put away people who had more money, more power, and more protection than we will ever have. And right now, he is quietly building a case that could destroy everything. Lance's expression hardened. How much does he know? I don't know. That's the problem. His laptop was taken, but my contact says it was wiped before they got access. He's smarter than we gave him credit for. Then we deal with him the same way we deal with anyone who gets too curious. Catherine's hand shot out and gripped Lance's wrist with surprising force. No, absolutely not. George has contacts everywhere. If anything happens to him, anything at all, there will be an investigation that we cannot survive. We handle this quietly through legal channels, or we don't handle it at all. Lance pulled his arm back, rubbing his wrist. Fine. So what do you suggest? We accelerate the timeline. Move the remaining funds through the secondary accounts by end of week. Close out the Panama holdings. And most importantly, she pointed a manicured finger at his chest. You stop making stupid mistakes. What mistakes? The insider trading. The girls you've been taking to the Peninsula Hotel on the company card. The conversations you've been having on unsecured phones. Catherine stood, smoothing her jacket. You think nobody notices? You think George didn't notice? The man spent 20 years catching people who were more careful than you'll ever be. Lance's jaw tightened. I've been careful. You've been reckless. And your recklessness is what put us in this position. She walked to the door, then turned back. I protected you because you're family. But if you compromise this operation, if you give George Pierce one more piece of evidence to use against us, I will cut you loose so fast you'll think you were never part of this at all. She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. Lance sat alone in the dark conference room, staring at the city lights, his jaw working silently. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. The old man is digging. Handle it. He read the message 3 times, then deleted it. Mallory was getting impatient. That was never good. Lance had been careful, more careful than Catherine knew. The accounts she thought she controlled were actually his. The contacts she thought were loyal answered to someone else entirely. And the operation she thought she was running had been hijacked months ago by forces she couldn't begin to understand. George Pierce was a problem, yes. But George Pierce was also an opportunity. If the old man kept digging, he'd eventually find Catherine. And when the walls closed in, Lance would be long gone, along with the $47 million his aunt thought was safely hidden in offshore accounts. He pulled up a second phone from his jacket pocket, a burner, untraceable, and typed a quick message. Pierce is a liability. What's the extraction timeline? The response came 30 seconds later. 72 hours. Be ready to move. Lance smiled, pocketed the phone, and stood to leave. His aunt thought she was playing chess. She had no idea the board had already been swept clean, and she was standing on the only remaining square. Somewhere across the city, in a storage unit filled with files and secrets, George Pierce was reaching the same conclusion, though his path led in a very different direction. The game was accelerating, and only one player knew all the rules. The photograph landed on George's kitchen table with a soft slap. Marcus stood over him, breathing hard, as if he'd run the entire way from his car. This was taken yesterday, outside Catherine Turner's building. George picked up the image, holding it under the light. A man in his 60s, silver hair, expensive overcoat, climbing out of a black town car. The face was partially obscured by shadow, but the profile was unmistakable. John Mallory. Alive. Where did you get this? Old contact at Homeland. Facial recognition flagged him at O'Hare 6 weeks ago, entering the country on a Venezuelan passport under the name Carlos Menendez. Nobody followed up because Mallory's officially dead and the system isn't programmed to chase ghosts. George set the photograph down carefully, as if it might bite him. 6 weeks ago. That's 2 weeks before Catherine fired me. It gets worse. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat heavily, the wood creaking under his weight. I ran the secondary accounts you identified through some friends at Treasury. The money trail doesn't end in Panama. It runs through 3 additional cutouts before landing in an investment fund registered in the Caymans. Who controls the fund? On paper? A holding company owned by a law firm in Grand Cayman that exists only on paper. But the beneficial owner, the person who actually controls where that money goes. Marcus tapped the photograph. John Mallory. The same accounts he used 12 years ago, the same structure, the same signatures. He's been running this operation from the shadows ever since we thought he died. George's mind raced through the implications. Mallory hadn't just escaped justice. He'd spent 12 years rebuilding, reconnecting, infiltrating companies like Harrison and more through assets like Lance Bowman. Catherine, George said slowly. Does she know who she's working for? Unknown. My guess? She knows she's dirty but thinks she's the one in control. Mallory's smart enough to let his puppets believe they're pulling their own strings. George stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gray November sky. His reflection looked tired, old, defeated. But his eyes burned with something that had been dormant for far too long. This isn't just embezzlement, he said quietly. This is a network. Mallory spent 12 years building a network inside legitimate businesses, moving money, accumulating power. Harrison and Moore is just one piece. So what do we do? George turned back to face his old partner. We need 3 things. First, concrete evidence that Mallory is alive and actively directing this operation. Not just photographs, but documentation. Wire transfer authorizations, communication logs, something that proves he's giving orders. That's going to be extremely difficult. Second, we need proof that Catherine and Lance are knowingly participating in criminal activity. Not just circumstantial, hard evidence. Recordings, documents, something a prosecutor can take to a grand jury. Marcus nodded slowly. And third. George walked back to the table and picked up Mallory's photograph again. We need to find out who else is involved. A network this sophisticated doesn't run on 3 people. There are others, in the firm, outside the firm, maybe in places we haven't even considered yet. George, this is a massive undertaking. We're 2 retired agents running on favors and goodwill. Mallory has resources, protection, connections at every level. If he finds out we're coming for him, he already knows. George set the photograph down and met Marcus's eyes. That break-in at my house wasn't random intimidation. It was a test. They wanted to see how I'd react, whether I'd back off or push forward. And you pushed forward. Which means they're already planning their next move. We need to be faster, smarter, and more careful than we've ever been before. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, too slowly for normal traffic. Both men noticed. Neither commented. I have someone inside the firm, Marcus said finally. Low-level accounting department. She's been feeding me information for 3 months, ever since she noticed irregularities in the quarterly reports. Catherine doesn't know she exists. Can you trust her? She's terrified, but she's honest. Her father was a cop who died investigating Mallory's organization back in 2009. She didn't know that when she took the job at Harrison and Moore. When I told her, she offered to help without asking for anything in return. George nodded slowly. What's her name? Elena Vasquez. 28 years old. Smart, careful, and angry at exactly the right people. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed George a photograph. A young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, standing in what looked like a break room, coffee cup in hand. Set up a meeting. Somewhere safe, somewhere we can talk without being observed. Already done. Tomorrow, 6 p.m., the Garfield Park Conservatory. She'll be in the Palm House, pretending to look at plants. George almost smiled. Almost. And Marcus, I need you to reach out to everyone we still trust at the Bureau. Not officially, not through channels. Quietly. If this goes where I think it's going, we're going to need backup that can't be bought or intimidated. Marcus stood, pocketing his phone. George, you know what you're asking. If this blows up, if we're wrong about any of this. We're not wrong. Our careers, our pensions, maybe our lives. Mallory doesn't leave witnesses. George walked Marcus to the door, stepping out onto the porch where the cold air bit at their faces. The suspicious car had moved on, but George knew it would be back. I spent 30 years putting away criminals who thought they were above the law, George said. I watched Mallory slip through our fingers, watched him fake his death and rebuild his empire while good people paid for his crimes. Catherine Turner thought she could erase 23 years of my life with a 30-second meeting. He looked at Marcus with the cold certainty of a man who had made his decision and would not be moved. This isn't about revenge. This is about finishing what I started. And I don't care what it costs. Marcus held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once and walked to his car. George watched him drive away, then turned and went back inside to prepare for the meeting that would determine everything. The storm was coming, and this time he would be ready. What George didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Elena Vasquez had a secret of her own. A secret that would change everything he thought he understood about this conspiracy. And somewhere in the shadows of Harrison and more advisors, Lance Bowman was making a phone call that would set the final pieces in motion. "The meeting is set," Lance said into his burner phone. "Tomorrow. Garfield Park. He's walking right into our hands." The voice on the other end laughed softly. "Perfect. Let him come." Elena Vasquez was already dead when George arrived at the Garfield Park Conservatory. He didn't know this yet. He stood inside the Palm House at exactly 6 p.m., surrounded by tropical plants and humid air that fogged his glasses, waiting for a woman who would never come. 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. George checked his phone. No messages from Marcus. No calls. Nothing. The conservatory was nearly empty at this hour. A few college students sketching leaves, an elderly couple holding hands near the orchid display. Normal. Peaceful. Wrong. His instincts screamed at him to move. George walked calmly toward the exit, his pace measured, his breathing controlled. He'd learned long ago that running attracted attention, and attention attracted bullets. The parking lot outside was quiet. His rental car sat where he'd left it, undisturbed. He was reaching for the door handle when his phone finally buzzed. "Marcus, don't go home. They found Elena this morning. Made it look like a robbery. Meet me at the backup location. Come alone." George read the message twice, then deleted it. Elena Vasquez. 28 years old. A woman who wanted justice for her father's death. Gone before she could help bring down the people responsible. He sat in the car for a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The anger that rose inside him was cold, controlled, familiar. He'd felt it before, every time an innocent person paid the price for someone else's greed. Mallory. Catherine. They thought killing Elena would silence the investigation. They thought George would be scared, would back off, would retreat into the quiet retirement they'd tried to force on him. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The backup location was a storage facility in Cicero, owned by a shell company that George had set up 15 years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. Marcus was already there when he arrived, pacing between towers of boxes with his phone pressed to his ear. "How bad?" George asked as he stepped inside. Marcus ended his call and turned, his face gray. "Bad. They staged it perfectly, broken window, ransacked apartment, wallet and phone missing. Chicago PD is calling it a mugging gone wrong. Case will be closed in a week." "Who found her?" Neighbor heard screaming at 4 a.m. By the time police arrived, she was already cold. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. "George, this is my fault. I brought her into this. I told her she'd be protected. You didn't kill her. They did." George pulled out a folding chair and sat, his knees protesting the cold metal. "What did she send you before she died?" Marcus blinked. "What?" Elena was smart. She knew she was taking a risk. If she had information worth killing for, she would have made copies. Backups. Insurance. George leaned forward. "What did she send you?" For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he reached into his jacket and withdrew a USB drive, different from the one George had shown him weeks ago. "This arrived in my email at 3:47 a.m. Time-stamped 40 minutes before the neighbor heard screaming. She must have known they were coming." George took the drive carefully, turning it over in his fingers like a sacred object. "What's on it?" "I haven't looked yet. Wanted to wait for you." They set up a laptop on a plastic crate, connected the drive, and watched as folders populated the screen. Financial records. Communication logs. Photographs. Video files. Elena Vasquez had spent 3 months documenting everything. George clicked on the first video file. The screen filled with grainy footage from what appeared to be a hidden camera in a conference room, Catherine's conference room on the 47th floor. Catherine's voice came through the speakers, slightly distorted but unmistakable. "The Pierce situation is handled. He signed the severance agreement without a fight." Another voice, "Lance, What about his files? The old man's been keeping records for years. Already taken care of. The team will handle his house tonight. And if he doesn't back off? The pause. Then Catherine, then we handle him the way we handled Alderman Reyes in 2019. Make it look natural. The video ended. George stared at the black screen, his heart pounding in his chest. Elena had captured a confession, a direct threat, evidence that would be admissible in any court in the country. And she had died to get it to them. There's more, Marcus said quietly, clicking through the folders. Bank transfers, shell company registrations, even a photograph of Lance meeting with someone outside a restaurant in Oak Park. George leaned closer to the screen. The photograph showed Lance shaking hands with a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow. But George recognized the coat, the posture, the silver hair. John Mallory. She got everything, George breathed. Everything we needed. She got killed for it too. Marcus closed the laptop and looked at his old partner. George, what do we do now? We can't go to the bureau. Mallory has contacts there. We can't go to Chicago PD. They've already buried the investigation. Who do we trust? George was quiet for a long moment, staring at the USB drive in his hand. We trust ourselves. And we finish what Elena started. He stood, slipping the drive into his pocket. Make copies. Multiple copies. Send them to everyone we know who can't be bought. Journalists, retired agents, federal prosecutors in other states. Create a dead man switch. What? If something happens to either of us, the files release automatically. Every news outlet, every law enforcement agency, every social media platform. Catherine and Lance and Mallory, they'll wake up one morning and discover their entire operation is front-page news. Marcus nodded slowly. And what are you going to do? George walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. I'm going to give them one last chance to destroy themselves. The storage facility door closed behind him with a metallic clang. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse suite overlooking Lake Michigan, John Mallory was celebrating what he thought was a successful operation. He had no idea his entire empire was about to come crashing down. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., and Catherine Turner arrived at 8:47, coffee in hand, victory already written on her face. 3 days had passed since Elena Vasquez's death. The police investigation had been closed. George Pierce hadn't been seen or heard from. The wire transfers were complete, the accounts were secured, and in 48 hours, she and Lance would be on a private plane to Grand Cayman with $47 million waiting in accounts that couldn't be traced. Everything was going according to plan. She stepped off the elevator onto the 47th floor and froze. George Pierce was sitting in the reception area, reading the Wall Street Journal as calmly as if he'd never been fired. Good morning, Catherine. He didn't look up from the paper. Beautiful day, isn't it? Catherine's coffee cup trembled slightly in her hand. What are you doing here? Security was supposed to revoke your access. They did. But it's amazing what a 30-year FBI career will do for your reputation. I mentioned to the guard downstairs that I needed to retrieve some personal items from my old desk. He was very understanding. You need to leave. Or I'm calling security. George folded the newspaper neatly and stood, brushing invisible lint from his jacket. I'd wait on that call if I were you. We need to talk. Privately. I have nothing to say to you. No. But I have something to show you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a USB drive, holding it up so the morning light caught its surface. Elena Vasquez sends her regards. The color drained from Catherine's face. That name means nothing to me. Really? Because she spent 3 months recording your conversations with Lance, including the one where you discussed making my death look natural. George's voice remained perfectly calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. Should I play the highlights for the board? I'm sure they'd find it enlightening. Catherine's jaw worked silently. Her eyes darted toward the conference room where board members were already gathering, visible through the glass walls like fish in an aquarium. What do you want? I want you to walk into that meeting and resign. Effective immediately. I want you to admit to the board that you've been embezzling company funds through offshore accounts. And I want you to give me the name of the man you've been working for. You're insane. Probably. But I'm also the only thing standing between you and a federal prison cell. George stepped closer, lowering his voice. Elena Vasquez is dead because of you. A 28-year-old woman whose only crime was wanting justice for her father. You killed her, or your people did, and you thought that would be the end of it. Catherine's composure cracked, just slightly. I didn't know they were going to. Don't. George's voice went cold. Don't pretend you're a victim here. You knew exactly what you were getting into when you climbed into bed with John Mallory. The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the reception desk. How do you? I know everything, Catherine. I've spent 30 years learning how to know everything. George tucked the USB drive back into his pocket. You have until the end of this meeting to make a choice. Resign and cooperate, or I release these files to every media outlet in the country. Your call. He walked past her toward the elevator, leaving her standing alone in the reception area, her empire crumbling around her. Catherine stood motionless for nearly a full minute. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd hoped never to use. We have a problem. Pierce has the files. All of them. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, familiar. Then we accelerate the timeline. Meet me at the Marina City garage in 2 hours. Bring Lance. What are you going to do? What I should have done 12 years ago. John Mallory's voice carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. End this permanently. The call disconnected. Catherine stared at her phone, then at the conference room where the board was waiting. She had a choice to make. Cooperate with George and spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Or follow Mallory's orders and pray that his plan worked. Neither option ended well for her. But only one option kept her alive long enough to find a way out. She straightened her jacket, fixed her smile, and walked into the board meeting. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we begin, I have an important announcement to make. The board members looked up expectantly. It has come to my attention that there are some irregularities in our financial reporting that require immediate investigation. I'm recommending that we bring in an outside auditor and temporarily suspend all major transactions until the review is complete. Murmurs rippled through the room. Lance, sitting at the far end of the table, went rigid with shock. Catherine met his eyes and held them. If she was going down, she was taking everyone with her. The parking garage beneath Marina City was empty except for 2 vehicles when George arrived at midnight. He'd followed Catherine from the board meeting, keeping 3 car lengths behind, watching as she picked up Lance from his apartment and drove to this concrete tomb overlooking the Chicago River. They'd been inside for 20 minutes now, and George could see their silhouettes through the frosted glass of a black SUV parked on the 3rd level. Marcus's voice crackled through the earpiece George wore. I've got eyes on 3 additional vehicles entering the lower level. Armed security by the look of them. This is a trap, George. I know. Then get out of there. Not yet. George checked his weapon, the same .38 revolver he'd carried for 40 years, and stepped out of his rental car. Is the backup in position? 2 blocks out. FBI tactical team, led by Director Morrison himself. Took some convincing, but when I showed him the files, he agreed to keep it off the books until we had confirmation. Tell them to hold position until I give the signal. George. Hold position, Marcus. George crossed the parking garage with measured steps, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls. The SUV's doors opened as he approached, and Catherine and Lance emerged, followed by 4 men in dark suits who moved with the coordinated precision of professional security. And behind them, stepping out of the shadows like a ghost returning from the dead, was John Mallory. Agent Pierce. Mallory's voice carried the same smooth confidence George remembered from their confrontations years ago. Or should I say former Agent Pierce? You've aged. So have you. Dying agrees with you. Mallory smiled. A necessary precaution. The investigation was getting too close. I needed time to rebuild, to reorganize. And now, thanks to your friends at Harrison and Moore, I have more power than I ever had in Congress. Had. Past tense. George kept his hands visible away from his weapon. Your operation is finished, John. The files are already with federal prosecutors. Every transaction, every shell company, every conversation Catherine and Lance had about your little scheme. Even if you kill me tonight, those files will be released at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Mallory's smile faltered. You're bluffing. Am I? George reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew his phone. One call. That's all it takes. One call and every news organization in the country gets a copy of everything Elena Vasquez compiled before your people murdered her. Lance stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. You don't know anything, old man. You're just some washed up. Shut up, Lance. Catherine's voice cut through the garage like a blade. She'd been watching George carefully, reading his posture, his confidence. He's not bluffing. Smart woman. George turned back to Mallory. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to surrender yourselves to federal custody. All of you. Right now. Mallory laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the concrete. And why would we do that? Because the alternative is much worse. George pressed a button on his phone. Director Morrison? You can send them in now. The screech of tires filled the garage as 3 FBI tactical vehicles came roaring up the entrance ramp, lights flashing, agents pouring out with weapons drawn. Mallory's security team reached for their guns, but they were surrounded before they could draw. John Mallory. Director Morrison stepped forward, holding a warrant. You're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 30 other charges I'll read to you on the way to processing. Mallory's face went pale. He looked at George with something approaching respect. How long have you been planning this? 12 years. George watched as agents handcuffed Catherine and Lance, their protests drowning in the chaos. Ever since you slipped through my fingers the first time. I knew you weren't dead. I knew you'd surface eventually. I just needed to wait. And Harrison and more? A trap. I applied for that job specifically because I knew your network was connected to the firm. Took me 7 years to find the evidence, but I knew it was there. George stepped closer, close enough to see the sweat beading on Mallory's forehead. You thought you were using Catherine. You thought you were running an untraceable operation. But the whole time I was watching, documenting, waiting. Mallory's composure finally cracked. You destroyed your own career. You let them fire you, humiliate you. I let them think they won. George's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. That's always been your weakness, John. You underestimate patient people. Agents led Mallory toward a waiting vehicle, his hands cuffed behind his back. Catherine followed, silent and broken. Lance struggled briefly before being forced into a separate car, shouting threats that nobody listened to. Marcus appeared at George's side, watching the procession. It's over. George didn't respond immediately. He watched the vehicles pull away, carrying 3 people who had tried to destroy him, murder an innocent woman, and escape justice through wealth and power. No, he said finally. It's just beginning. There are trials to come. Testimony to give. A network to dismantle. But tonight... George looked up at the concrete ceiling of the garage, then out toward the Chicago skyline visible through the exit. Tonight, we remember Elena Vasquez. And tomorrow, we make sure her sacrifice wasn't wasted. He walked toward his car, exhaustion finally settling into his bones. The storm had broken. But the work wasn't finished yet. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had never seen a trial quite like this one. For 6 weeks, prosecutors presented evidence that traced John Mallory's corruption network across 3 decades, implicating dozens of politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials. The gallery was packed every day with journalists, curious citizens, and victims of Mallory's schemes who had waited years for this moment. George Pierce sat in the front row, watching as his life's work was finally validated. Catherine Turner had taken a plea deal on the 3rd day of trial, agreeing to testify against Mallory and Lance in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was devastating: names, dates, amounts, methods. She described how Mallory had recruited her 15 years ago, how he'd promised her power and wealth in exchange for access to Harrison and Moore's client base. She described the decision to fire George. "We knew he was investigating," Catherine said from the witness stand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lance told me that Mallory wanted him removed before he could find anything damaging. I thought if we just let him go quietly, he'd disappear." The prosecutor leaned forward. "And when he didn't disappear?" Catherine's eyes found George in the gallery. For a moment, something like shame flickered across her features. "Mallory ordered the break-in at his house. And when that didn't work," her voice broke, "he ordered the hit on Elena Vasquez." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison called for order. "Miss Turner, did John Mallory personally order the murder of Elena Vasquez?" "Yes." The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. "He said she was a liability, that she knew too much. He said," Catherine paused, steadying herself. "He said killing her would send a message." George closed his eyes. He could see Elena's photograph in his mind, the serious dark eyes, the determined set of her jaw. A woman who had risked everything for justice. A woman who had paid the ultimate price. Lance Bowman's testimony was less cooperative. He denied everything, claimed he was a victim of his aunt's manipulation, insisted that he had no knowledge of Mallory's criminal activities. The jury didn't believe a word of it. But the moment everyone had been waiting for came on the 32nd day of trial, when John Mallory himself took the stand. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as the former congressman settled into the witness chair. He looked smaller than George remembered, diminished by weeks of incarceration, stripped of the expensive suits and powerful aura that had once made him untouchable. The prosecutor approached slowly. "Mr. Mallory, you've heard the testimony of Catherine Turner and numerous other witnesses. You've seen the financial records, the communications, the surveillance footage. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Mallory's eyes swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on George in the front row. "I built an empire," he said quietly. "For 30 years, I operated in the shadows of American power, facilitating deals, moving money, connecting people who needed things done with people who could do them. I've dined with presidents. I've shaped legislation. I've made billionaires." He leaned forward, his voice carrying an edge of defiance. "And none of you would have known about any of it if it weren't for one stubborn old man who couldn't accept that he'd lost." The prosecutor stepped aside. "Your witness." George's attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Sarah Chin who had jumped at the chance to help take down Mallory, rose from her seat. "Mr. Mallory, you've described your activities as facilitating deals and connecting people. But isn't it true that those activities included bribery, extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder?" "Allegedly." "Allegedly." Sarah nodded, pulling up a document on the courtroom's display screen. "This is a wire transfer authorization signed by you, dated March 15th of this year. It directs the movement of $12 million from a Harrison and Moore client account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Is that your signature?" Mallory squinted at the screen. "It appears to be." And this communication, recovered from Lance Bowman's burner phone. Another document appeared. A text message instructing him to handle the Pierce situation permanently. "Did you send this message?" A long pause. Mallory's lawyer objected, but Judge Harrison overruled. "Did you send this message, Mr. Mallory?" "I may have." "May have." Sarah turned to face the jury. "And this video." She pressed play on a recording that George recognized immediately. Elena's footage from the hidden camera. Shows Catherine Turner discussing plans to make George Pierce's death look natural. "Were you aware of this conversation?" "I don't recall." "You don't recall." Sarah walked slowly toward the witness stand. "Mr. Mallory, Elena Vasquez was murdered on November 14th of last year. 2 days before her death, she emailed these files to Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent working with George Pierce. The metadata on these files proves they came from Harrison and Moore's internal servers. Ms. Vasquez died trying to expose your crimes. Do you recall that?" Mallory's face had gone gray. No further questions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, George sat motionless in his seat. He'd waited 12 years for this moment. through the humiliation of his firing, through the terror of the break-in, through the grief of Elena's death. Justice had finally been served. As bailiffs led Mallory from the courtroom, the convicted man paused beside George's row. "You destroyed everything I built," Mallory said, his voice low and venomous. George stood slowly, meeting the man's eyes. "No. You destroyed it yourself. I just made sure everyone knew." Mallory was led away. George walked out of the courthouse into the Chicago afternoon, where Marcus and Director Morrison were waiting. "Congratulations," Morrison said, shaking George's hand. "You brought down one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in American history." "We brought it down," George corrected. "Elena Vasquez brought it down. I just finished what she started." He looked up at the courthouse steps, at the journalists and photographers jostling for position, at the ordinary citizens who had stopped to watch the spectacle. "There's one more thing I need to do," George said. He walked to the waiting microphones, where reporters were already shouting questions. "Mr. Pierce! Mr. Pierce! How does it feel to see John Mallory convicted?" George waited for the noise to subside. "Today's verdict belongs to Elena Vasquez," he said quietly. "A young woman who gave her life to expose corruption that had infected our institutions for decades. She never wanted recognition. She never wanted fame. She just wanted justice for her father and for everyone else who suffered because powerful people thought they were above the law." He paused, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I spent 23 years at Harrison and Moore. I was fired because I asked too many questions. But the truth doesn't care about organizational charts or severance packages. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard people try to bury it." He looked directly into the cameras. "If you're watching this and you're afraid to speak up about corruption, about abuse, about injustice, remember Elena Vasquez. Remember that one person can make a difference. And remember that patient people always win in the end." He turned and walked away from the microphones, leaving the reporters clamoring for more. Marcus fell into step beside him. "That was quite a speech." George smiled, the first genuine smile in months. Elena deserved it. She deserved all of this. They walked in comfortable silence toward Marcus's car. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. George breathed in the cold November air and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. 6 months later, George Pierce stood in the garden of a modest brownstone on Chicago's South Side, watching as a bronze plaque was unveiled. The Elena Vasquez Memorial Scholarship Fund. The inscription read, "For students pursuing careers in forensic accounting and financial investigation, in honor of a woman who sought truth at any cost." The crowd was small but meaningful. Elena's mother, red-eyed but proud, Marcus Webb and his wife, Director Morrison representing the FBI, Sarah Chin, who had become a friend during the long months of trial preparation. And in the back, almost invisible among the mourners, stood a young man in his early 20s with serious eyes that reminded George of someone he'd once known. Elena's younger brother. After the ceremony, the young man approached George hesitantly. "Mr. Pierce? I'm Daniel. Daniel Vasquez." George shook his hand. "I know who you are. Elena talked about you. She said you were studying law at Northwestern." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For making sure her death meant something." "Your sister was the bravest person I've ever known," George said quietly. "She knew the risks. She knew what could happen. And she did it anyway, because she believed that justice mattered more than her own safety." "Did it?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Did it matter? Mallory's in prison, but Elena's gone. My parents will never be the same. Was it worth it?" George was silent for a long moment, considering the question. "I can't answer that for you," he said finally. "I can tell you that because of what Elena did, $47 million was recovered and returned to the people it was stolen from. I can tell you that 14 corrupt officials are now serving sentences alongside Mallory. I can tell you that the precedent set by this case will make it harder for the next John Mallory to hide in the shadows." He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "But was it worth Elena's life? That's a question only you and your family can answer. What I can tell you is this: your sister didn't die as a victim. She died as a warrior. And the world is better because she fought. Daniel wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders. I'm going to finish law school, he said. And then I'm going to do what Elena did. I'm going to find the people who think they're untouchable and bring them down. George smiled. She'd be proud of you. As the crowd dispersed and the afternoon light began to fade, George walked to his car alone. The settlement from his wrongful termination lawsuit against Harrison and Moore had been generous, enough to fund the scholarship in Elena's name with plenty left over. Not that the money mattered. What mattered was that Catherine Turner was serving 15 years in a federal prison. Lance Bowman had received 12. And John Mallory would spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of the power and influence he'd spent decades accumulating. George's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Morrison wants to talk. Says the Bureau could use a consultant on cold cases. Interested? George typed back. Tell him I'll think about it. He drove through the city streets, past the towering glass facade of what had once been Harrison and Moore Advisors, now rebranded and under new management, desperately trying to distance itself from the scandal that had nearly destroyed it. Past the coffee shop on Michigan Avenue where he and Marcus had plotted their investigation over countless cups of burnt espresso. Past the storage facility in Cicero where Elena's files had changed everything. Finally, he pulled into his driveway, parked, and sat for a moment in the silence. 23 years at Harrison and Moore. Fired without cause. Humiliated in front of his colleagues. Threatened, investigated, targeted for murder. And in the end he had won. Not through violence, not through revenge, but through patience, preparation, and an unshakable belief that the truth always comes out. George walked into his house and sat in his favorite chair by the window. The evening news was running a story about the sentencing hearing for one of Mallory's associates, another domino falling in the cascade that had begun with Elena's files. His wife, Margaret, brought him a cup of tea and kissed his forehead. Quite a day, she said. Quite a year. What happens now? George looked out the window at the fading sunset, at the city that had been his home for nearly 50 years, at the world that kept turning despite all the darkness that people tried to spread. Now. He sipped his tea. Now I rest. For a little while. Margaret smiled and settled into the chair beside him. And then? George's eyes found the framed photograph on the mantel. Elena Vasquez, serious and determined, taken at a company picnic 3 months before her death. And then I find the next person who thinks they're above the law. And I remind them that they're not. The sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows across a city that had witnessed corruption, justice, sacrifice, and redemption. And in a modest house on the north side, a 72-year-old former FBI agent finished his tea, kissed his wife goodnight, and went to bed knowing that his work, his real work, was far from over. Some battles take decades to win. Some enemies take years to defeat. And some people, no matter how old, how tired, or how forgotten they seem, are never truly powerless. George Pierce had proven that. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Elena Vasquez was smiling. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never underestimate a patient man. And never, ever fire someone without understanding exactly who they are. Because you never know when that quiet person in the corner is watching, waiting, preparing, and ready to expose everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of patience and the importance of standing up for what's right, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that inspires and challenges you. We have more incredible stories coming. Stories of ordinary people who refused to be silenced, who fought back against impossible odds, and who proved that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever watched someone powerful think they could get away with anything? What would you have done in George's position? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who might be facing their own battle against corruption or injustice. Someone who needs to remember that one person with enough patience and courage can change everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, the truth always comes out. See you in the next story.